Good evening and welcome back to the virtual Cambridge Union. We hope that you had a restful Easter vacation. In the final day of our preterm online series, we will be welcoming the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. Kim Campbell is a Canadian politician, lawyer, and writer who is the 19th Prime Minister of Canada as the first and only woman to hold the position. Previously, as Justice Minister, she brought about a new rape law and a rape shield law, cementing her legacy of supporting sexual victims. She has also published an autobiography, Time and Chance, which became a Canadian bestseller. Please welcome Kim Campbell, who will be giving a talk on the future of democracy and answering questions afterwards. Please submit your questions using the form in our bio and remember to like and subscribe. Over to you, Ms. Campbell.
Oh, you're waiting for me?
Yep.
Good evening, and how nice to be with you. This has become a whole new world of communicating with people via Zoom, but it's it's great to be able to do it. And the one thing is, I'm speaking to you from Italy. I don't have to get on a plane to go. I don't have to worry about COVID. I don't have to have a vaccine passport or anything. So it's very comfortable. So we're all ready to go now. Yep, good. Okay. I was joking with Tara before we started that in some places when I'm introduced as the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, Americans will say, oh, and is there a Left Honourable? And it's nice to be in a country like Britain where it's not an unusual title. But in Canada, it's interesting to know only 3 positions carry the title Right Honourable. And that is the Prime Minister, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Governor General. So it's a very uncommon title in Canada. Most of our cabinet ministers are simply the Honourable. So when I became the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, when I was Defence Minister, I was the Honourable. Now I'm the Right Honourable, and I have that for life. My sister calls me Right Honey, so it's not necessarily anything that creates a diffidence in people. I wanted to speak to you tonight. I wanted to throw out some ideas, and hopefully you will have some questions or comments that will stimulate a conversation that will be in line with what your interests are. It's always a challenge trying to decide what people might be interested in hearing, but I'm reminded in speaking to you, students, and I suppose some of you may not be students, but those of you who are, that just over 50 years ago, hard to imagine, in 1970, I arrived in London as a graduate student at the London School of Economics. And I had done my undergraduate degree at a year of graduate work at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And I was actually accepted to study international politics, but I wanted to switch to Soviet studies. And there was a wonderful expert at the LSE named Leonard Shapiro, and he agreed to take me as a student. And that began a whole new foray for me, because why I was so interested is that I was very interested in questions of world peace and stability. Both my parents were in uniform in World War II. I grew up as a baby boomer where World War II was a constant theme in movies, TV, books. And it was such an extraordinary cataclysm. And of course, it's an incredibly important part of the British self-identity and experience. But I wanted to be part of something that would stop that from happening again. And one of the things I became interested in was what it was like to, what countries were like that hadn't become democracies after World War II. And so I did my doctoral work on looking at the way the Soviet political socialization system dealt with de-Stalinization when Nikita Khrushchev decided to debug Stalin instead of making him the god to attack him as somebody who had been actually kind of a criminal and had undermined the Soviet Union and Soviet people. All of a sudden, here is this very authoritarian country that has one version of its history suddenly shifting gears. How do they do that? How do they create their legitimacy? So that was the academic, the scholarly topic I was looking at. But in 1972, I got a travel grant from the Canada Council to go and spend 3 months in the Soviet Union. My research materials were in the West, so it wasn't, I didn't go for that particular purpose. But what I did was I wanted to get a feel for what it was like. And I guess why I'm raising this is because I think we are all products of our time. And sometimes it's hard to understand or to really internalize the reality that other people haven't experienced the world the same way you have. And I remember when I eventually went back and started teaching at the university in Vancouver, how every once in a while it would strike me that things that were normal to me or very familiar to me were not familiar to my students. So I was teaching a course in comparative Soviet American government and talking about religion and politics. I said, well, as you recall, during the Kennedy campaign, well, of course, these students had no idea about the Kennedy campaign. They were little kids when John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960. At one point, I remember teaching and thinking that World War II was farther from the lives of the students I was teaching than World War I had been when I was a student, because actually the time between World Wars I and II wasn't all that great. So we have to realize that and one of the reasons to have generational diversity in organizations is that there are so many different perspectives that come from our different generations, whether it's perspectives on understanding how to use technology, and even those differences can come within families where older siblings have a whole different reality from younger siblings who make them feel completely out of date. But that it's easy to make assumptions and to assume that people have learned the lessons or who get things in the same way you do when you live more closely to certain kinds of historical experiences. So we all have a span of history that's real to us. And in my case, I was born after World War II, but my parents lived through the Great Depression. My grandmother was alive when I was young, so I remember the stories of the Depression and a little bit about World War I. My grandfather was in the Canadian Army during World War I. So that was sort of my time frame. And I realized that for others it's different. And this is very important in terms of how we look at democracy, because I think democracy is seriously under threat. And you may see people of my generation fretting in newspapers and being concerned because we see things happening that we could not imagine would ever happen again. Being raised on the history of World War II, the rise of fascism in Europe and in Japan, militarism, particularly in Japan, and seeing some of the old tropes coming out again and similar kinds of thinking. Or having been a child, I mean, I graduated from high school in 1964, so I was a student in the late 60s. And to see people questioning some of the gains in civil rights and legal protections that were so important to my generation when we were young, to see people either questioning them or attacking them, it's really very difficult. So I'm very interested in your own views about democracy and how you see it, because in my view, from what I have seen, when I went to the Soviet Union, it was an experience that I don't know that it's easy for you to have now. You could have it, I suppose, to some degree in China, although China is very complicated. But to go to a country where people couldn't say what they wanted to say, and here, even more important, that the interesting thing about China and the Soviet Union in those days, it wasn't that you had a hard time getting in, but that they couldn't get out. And if you can imagine what it is like to live in a society where your right to leave is non-existent. And in fact, you're even seen as a bit of a traitor if you should want to leave. If you want to leave to study or to perform or to do something someplace else, you kind of have to leave somebody as a hostage back to guarantee that you'll return. So spending 3 months in the Soviet Union, and I spoke a little bit of Russian. My Russian wasn't great, but I spoke a bit of Russian. And I traveled around. And although each city I went to, I had a guided center, but I was able to see a fair amount on my own. It was an absolute revelation to me about what it meant to live in a society where you didn't have any rights, where the customer is always wrong. And you'd watch people going into a bank or a store and try to figure out how they could ingratiate themselves with the person behind the counter or manipulate that person behind the counter to give them some kind of decent service or something that they need, because they had no right to ask for it. They didn't have any leverage just by virtue of being there and being a citizen, and as I say, being a customer. Say, well, I'm not going to bring my custom here again. Well, there really wasn't any place else to go if you didn't like Goom, the big department store in Moscow, for example. So it was really very interesting for me. And now I'm speaking to you from Italy. My father was in the Canadian Army in World War II and fought here in Italy, and he was wounded but survived. But his best friend was killed and is buried in Ravenna. And throughout Europe, I often see these graves of Canadians who fought and died in World War II. And it's interesting to note that all of them were volunteers. We had no conscription for overseas service, so every one of them signed up to come. And to think of the huge price that was paid to defeat fascism and then to see things coming back again. So I think it's really important for each generation to kind of rediscover and recommit itself to democratic institutions, albeit being critical of them and finding ways to help them to develop and evolve into new realities. And to meet the challenges of new eras. So, for example, the whole technological revolution with social media and the internet and these hugely powerful companies that have become so influential in how we think and how we make choices and how we interact with people with very little accountability. And I think it's interesting for me to watch democratic institutions, whether it's in the European Union or in countries like my own, or the United States, people trying to see how they can deal with these huge powers that don't fit into the old categories of who's powerful. And we used to think powerful people, different levels of government, or maybe people who had money because they ran businesses, and therefore people wanted to make sure that there was employment, etc. But it's a whole new different kind of power because it's sort of under the radar in the sense that people are being manipulated, and there are algorithms that play into the worst possible scenarios because conflict and controversy is profitable. The more people can keep you online, the more money they make because your eyeballs are money. So I think what I would say is that I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned because things can be lost. We used to talk about the Whig conception of history, and Herbert Butterfield, the English philosopher, who sort of thought everything was sort of getting better. That was the Whig conception, was that history was a constant unfolding of progress. Well, we have seen that history can regress in the sense that people can lose freedoms, they can lose the protections of institutions. And frankly, I watch what's happening in the United States now, and I'm really, really horrified. So what I would say to young people who are studying and who are exploring ideas and who are going to be the leaders of the future, and of course we all say this every generation, they said it to my generation too, but we are who we are, and we have the outlook that we have, but that understanding that governance and democratic institutions and their survival is really fundamental, that it really matters. And it's easy to be cynical because we've seen now that people manipulate institutions and manipulate their followers. But more than ever, I think it matters to care about institutions and the rule of law. And I just did a conversation with people at the American Bar Association the other day, talking about the rule of law. And the rule of law is the foundation stone of democracy. Elections are extremely important, but the rule of law is the most important. And I hope that as you are exploring the world in what you're studying, in the natural sciences, in the humanities, etc., will understand that this framework within which you operate in the governance of your country and more broadly in the world has a huge impact on your ability to do the things that you want to do, your huge ability on your survival. And if you watch what's been happening to the Russian dissident Alexei Navalny, what he is going through and the kind of attack on him was actually pretty common for a long time. And these are the stakes when we don't shore up and defend our democratic institutions. They are imperfect, and Winston Churchill's has got a quote for everything, but I think one of the most well used quotes from his own life was when he said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others, and that is true. It's full of those of us who are privileged to live in democratic societies and to be protected by democratic institutions need to think of how we can be defenders of those institutions and hopefully improvers of them also. I'm going to stop here and let you pose some questions. And I'm very interested to hear your own views of how you see it. Are you cynical? Are you think it doesn't matter? Are you politically engaged? What do you think about democracy in the 21st century?
Well, I would hope that all our viewers are politically engaged. Actually, you've jumped the gun a little bit here. Our first debate tomorrow is on the motion, "This House believes we are witnessing a global fascist resurgence." And you've mentioned old tropes coming back in Japan. I want to ask you whether you'd agree with this statement and why.
Well, yes, I would, and you know, and I'm not a doom and gloomer. I also think there are all sorts of wonderful things going on, and I think there are people who are very courageous. But I think the problem is that Hannah Arendt once said that one of the characteristics of totalitarianism, and we see it also in the rise of fascism, is not when people don't believe things, but when they have a sense that nothing is true, that truth doesn't really exist. And when you're at a university, I think one of the things that you need to commit yourself to is the search for truth. Truth can be often elusive, and it can change. In science, we find things out, and then we do more experiments, and we test things, and we find out different things. It's a constant evolution, but it doesn't mean that there aren't things that we cannot know. And I think that there are many, many characteristics of what we're seeing today that really do resonate with the memories of the 1930s. And it's scary as hell, because you know where it leads. And you can see it, you know, people, the cults of Donald Trump and there's a Canadian named Daniel Dale who wrote for the Toronto Star, who made it his mission when Donald Trump was elected president to catalog all of the lies that he told. And I think by the time he got to the end of the Trump administration, it was over 20,000. In fact, then he got well known, and he was on CNN doing his little reprises every day of the lies of the day. But people say, well, all politicians lie. Well, sometimes you have your tendency, you don't want to tell people everything. You may want to burnish your own resume a bit. There are things, but there are other things where the lies are so barefaced, and sometimes without even a purpose. Like, what was the purpose of lying about the size of your inauguration crowd? It has nothing to do with trying to persuade people of X. What it's trying to do is to undermine their sense that you can believe anything, that nothing is true. So yeah, I think your debate's going to be very interesting, and I'm thrilled that you're having it, because it suggests to me that you're plugged in, and it's not just us old geezers who are worried.
You've also mentioned truth and the importance of truth and accountability. And then you've also spoken about how you feel like the rule of law is most important in a democracy. How do you see the relationship between those two concepts working?
Well, the rule of law is very important, but I think it's also important to point out that law is not written in stone, and it's not something that comes from some Olympian height. Law is a social creation. And one of the things that's been very important to me in my career in public life, I spent 3 years as the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. So I was responsible for legislating the criminal law. The important thing is to make the law just and fair and inclusive. And many of us have lived in societies, and I'm old enough to have seen the change in my own society, where some people, are not being thought of when people are making laws, when laws are made that are systemically discriminatory to some people. I was the first woman to be Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and I convened a national symposium on women, law, and the administration of justice. I wanted to mark the fact that this was a historic first. And we brought people together from across the country to, ask a lot of different people what they thought we should talk about, because I can't represent all women. I don't know what all women are thinking. But what was interesting was when the judges who came to the conference, and, judges know that if the minister is hosting it, their independence will be respected. But several judges who came and observed the conversation said after, before I came, I thought I was quite liberal on these issues, and I realized I didn't know anything. So when we talk about the rule of law, the reason why the democratic institutions are important is that laws need to be perfected. Laws need to respond to changing needs. So we have fundamental laws that have principles like the right to a free trial, the right to free speech, these kinds of things, which are principles that get restated in different contexts. Those are important, but we also need to have a rule of law where the law itself is seen to serve people and to include all people in its protections. And that's how you have confidence in it. When people think the law doesn't serve them, then you get the kind of cynicism and disaffection and alienation that makes people vulnerable to anti-democratic movements.
On the point about cynicism and alienation, what would you say is the distinction between being critical of democratic institutions, especially those who have been mistreated and felt not included by democracies in history, versus attacking the quote-unquote institutional framework or crossing the line into manipulation and other anti-democratic forces?
Well, sometimes it may be a fine line, but I think there's a difference between wanting to build better, criticizing because you want to build better, and being nihilistic and thinking nothing could ever work. If you tear things down, sometimes things need to be torn down and replaced with other things. But that form of destruction it has to be very delicate. I mean, that's why reform, in my lifetime, there have been extraordinary changes in the law, extraordinary expansions of protection. Even since I was a justice minister, I introduced an amendment to make sexual orientation a prohibited ground of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act, for example. And at that time, nobody was lobbying for same-sex marriage or anything like that. I mean, it gave people what they could have spousal relationships that were recognized in the law. They were very happy. In 2005, not all that long later, Canada passed a law making same-sex marriage legal. That was a dramatic shift in expansion of legal protections. Similarly, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we brought in, we have a substantive Bill of Rights in our Constitution now. You don't have quite the same thing in Britain. It doesn't mean you don't have human rights, but the legal foundation of them is different. But this one of the things it protected was if people against discrimination based on your sex, and all of a sudden that gave women in various segments of society who believed they were being discriminated against a legal tool to expand their rights. So the rule of law is also a legal tool. So not everybody is always going to like the results of these things, but I think the desire to criticize, to try and make it better. And I think it's interesting that some of us, when we hear a criticism, we're kind of offended because it doesn't seem so bad to us, but that's partly because we haven't been negatively affected. Maybe that's partly a privilege that we have, that certain kinds of problems don't land on our doorstep because of the color of our skin or where we're from or the way we speak, etc. So I think it is important to be open to the fact. I mean, I think the revelations we are seeing about the way Black people are treated by law enforcement in the United States, I think there are a lot of people, a lot of white Americans who've actually been deeply shocked by the George Floyd murder and aftermath, because seeing the video of the policeman with his knee on George Floyd's neck, for people, you couldn't avoid it. You couldn't make an excuse. You couldn't say, oh, he probably asked for it or he did something or whatever. And those are shocking events which make people more open to the idea that the law needs to change or needs to be more expansive in its protections. So I think the question is, am I working to try and make things better, or am I just wanting to tear everything down? Because when you tear everything down, you get a vacuum, and into that vacuum often come a lot of forces that are very destructive and are not interested in protecting the rights of you and me.
Yeah, on the question of building things back better and making sure that people aren't tearing things down, a subject of yours that you've spoken extensively about is gender parity quotas. How do you think the world can achieve them without being tokenistic? And you've also mentioned visibility. Do you think that's the key barrier to getting more women into office, or are there deeper and more systemic issues?
Well, I think there are deep systemic issues. It's about power. People who have it don't like to give it up. So whatever privilege they can use to hang on to it, they often will. I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question you were talking?
Oh, the first question was about gender parity quotas.
Yes. Sorry. It's interesting. There have been gender parity laws. Even France passed a gender parity law for some of their levels of government. And I prefer the term gender parity to others because it does suggest parity between both men and women. And it's interesting, in Norway, when they wanted to create gender parity on corporate boards, they passed a law that said you can have no fewer than 40% of either gender on a board. So you couldn't have 75% women. And the idea is that the genders will be treated equally. So you've got to have at least 40% men, 40% women, and what you do with the other 20%, that's up to you.
Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that's an interesting formula. What I suggested in Canada is that if you look at the way women are gradually inching their way up, but at the rate we're going, it'll be another couple of 100 years before you get gender parity in Parliament. And I think the notion of gender parity should be something that's kind of foundational, that people should see it as kind of a natural thing, that yes, that when you have bodies that make decisions that affect people's lives, you need to have full representation. Now, within those categories, there's all sorts of other permutations and combinations, and I don't know that you can necessarily fine-tune them to match everything. But one of the things that I suggested in Canada was that we should create constituencies that elect two people, a man and a woman, from every constituency, because we have had a tradition in Canada for a variety of different reasons of having, particularly at the provincial level of British Columbia and in the Maritimes. In fact, I think even in Ontario, they once had systems where you elected about 8 people from one constituency. So this is something that we've done before, and in the Canadian Maritimes, it's interesting, it was done to balance the interests of Protestants and Catholics, so that in every constituency, a party would nominate a Protestant and a Catholic. So the Protestants would have somebody to vote for, the Catholics would have somebody to vote for, and there would be 2 people representing that constituency. They did away with it when those religious differences didn't seem to be politically important anymore. But I was saying that if we had a man and a woman from every constituency, you'd have instant parity. You wouldn't have people fighting about nominations and winnable seats for a party. And there'd be no difficulty for a prime minister in creating a gender balanced cabinet. But I think that and it's also not quotas. A lot of women don't like the idea of quotas because it often has been used as a way of undermining their right to be someplace. You only got this because, there was a quota. But I'll tell you something, when our current prime minister was first elected in 2015, Justin Trudeau, and he created a gender balanced cabinet, I think he was the 5th leader in the world who did it. In fact, when I was living in Spain in 2004, Jose Maria Zapatero created a gender balanced cabinet. There were about 5 governments in the world that did that at that time. And when Prime Minister Trudeau went off to some foreign meeting, he was meeting with the head of government who said, "Why did you create a gender balanced cabinet? Why didn't you just appoint on merit?" And he said, "If I'd appointed on merit, I'd have had more women." And, the assumption is that when you're putting women into these positions, that somehow you're compromising quality. Because men are assumed to be competent. And one of the things that is sort of a standard of gender analysis is that men are hired or appointed or elected based on their promise. Women are hired or elected or appointed based on what they've accomplished. So men don't feel the same need to have accomplished so much. The idea is, I'm a man, I'm, full of promise and you should elect me. Whereas with the woman, it's well, has she done enough? Has she really accomplished enough? And the first woman to be mayor of Ottawa, our capital city, once said that a woman had to be twice as good as a man in order to be thought half as good. But fortunately, that's easy. But it's very humorous, but it's not so funny if you're the person who's trying to match your extraordinary accomplishments against somebody who hasn't accomplished anything, but who everybody sees as kind of a natural fit because he looks like the person who usually does that job.
Speaking of that, how do you think, or if you think, sexism contributed to your political career or your losses at the end of 1993?
Well, I don't think there's any question about it. But I think, in some ways, my sex helped me when I was coming up because there weren't a lot of other women. And for people who wanted to support women, including a lot of men, there are a lot of men who think women are really great. I once chaired a foundation in Kiev, and I met with people, a group of Canadians who were doing business in Ukraine. And one man said, "I will only work with companies that are led by women." Forget it. There are a lot of ways that a lot of men think highly of women. But I think in my own career, I didn't understand it all, particularly when I was prime minister. But after I was out of office, there was a burgeoning of literature in social and cognitive psychology that helped me to understand what I'd experienced. But the bottom line was, nobody who looked or sounded like me had ever done that job before. And what I found in particular was that the press gallery, the Ottawa press gallery, who had covered national politics, that's what they did. For a lot of them, they just couldn't get them. I didn't look and sound like a prime minister. Well, of course I didn't. I'm not a man. And I think, so when you are the first non-prototypical person, you could be a woman, you could be a person of color, you could be a disabled person, you could just be, whatever it is about you that doesn't fit the stereotype, you're going to provoke a lot of visceral discomfort. And people would rather walk over hot coals than say, I'm a sexist or I'm bigoted in any way. So they look for ways to validate their discomfort. So that's why you never get the benefit of the doubt. So you make a mild error and people jump on you. Your opponent, who's a man and who's been around for a long time, can put his foot in his mouth up to his knee. And people say, oh, that's just him, he's just misspeaking. And it's very much a double standard. So you say, well, what do you do about it? And I said, well, the only thing you can do is to keep trying to be there and to reprogram people's expectations of who gets to do that job. So that, there still are a lot of jobs that used to be very male dominated, where we're more comfortable seeing women in them. It's still, for example, in the medical profession, there's tons of women doctors. They often don't have the stature that men do, in other words, the recognition. And there are still some people of certain generations who, when I say a young woman, I remember seeing a group of young women and thinking, that they were still students. And one said, well, I'm a pediatrician. We can all miss the boat in reconfiguring our expectations of who does what. But the answer is not to disappear and not do it. The answer is for brave people to step forward and create a new landscape from which people derive their sense of how the world works. And that landscape is including women in leadership positions. And I think if you look in Europe, look at somebody like Angela Merkel. When Angela Merkel was elected leader of the Christian Democratic Union, I was part of an organization of former presidents and prime ministers at Club of Madrid. And I can't remember who I was talking to, but I said, the German Social Democrats have elected a woman leader. Germany could have a female chancellor. And he said, oh, no. If they get elected, she won't be the chancellor, so-and-so. I said, well, how does that work? But it was so unthinkable to him that a woman could be chancellor of Germany that he assumed that even if her party won the election, somebody else in her party would be the chancellor. She wouldn't be. And now, as she's coming to the end of her term, she's one of the most respected leaders in Europe. She has totally reprogrammed our sense of how a female politician should appear. She wears her infinite number of colored jackets and dark pants, and she never wears a skirt. And and she says, you should cut your hair. So her hair, she doesn't let her hair go gray. But the point is that she has to be there for us to say, oh yeah, a leader could look like that. And there's more, but the Commissioner von der Leyen, Ursula von der Leyen, from the head of the European Commission, who just had that experience with the Turkish president and the foreign minister, where there wasn't a seat for her. I mean, it was a huge outrage that would never have happened for a man. But you just have to press on. And as we get more used to it, and we have to speak out about it. And happily, a lot of men are our allies. I don't give up on that at all.
Speaking of regrets and pressing on, what would you say is your biggest regret in your career to date?
Biggest regret?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't have the kind of frame of mind that things regretfully, just because I'm realistic, that you don't get do-overs. There's no mulligan in life. You live your life and you make your mistakes. And I keep thinking, if I hadn't made this mistake, I'd have made another mistake. I sometimes say that if I were talking to my 20-year-old self, I'd say, keep your languages up and your weight down. In other words, I've done more to keep my languages current. I mean, I still speak other languages, but I don't know. You can't, sometimes people say, well, would you run for the leadership again if you had to do over again? But in 1993, when Brian Mulroney announced he was stepping down right at the end of our mandate, and being in a parliamentary system, that you almost never go into the fifth year of your mandate, because at the end of the fifth year, the constitutional hook comes out and pulls you off the stage. You have to go because your mandate is up. So we were halfway through the fifth year of our mandate when I was elected. So there was no time to put a new face on the party. It was very, very difficult. But when he announced he was stepping down, over half of our caucus announced that they were supporting me. There are many senior ministers who wanted to be leader because we were the governing party, and whoever became leader was going to be prime minister, however rough a ride that was going to be. So I didn't really, I think, have a choice to say no. I mean, I couldn't say, well, I don't know, I'm not sure we're going to win. All you could do is try to do it. And what is interesting is that in the years since, there's always, naysayers, but I've been amazed at how many people I have met for whom that was a really important time. And they'll say to me, you got a raw deal, you took the ball from Mulroney, or that, it wasn't really fair for you. They don't blame me for the defeat. But what they say is, I created a leadership college at the University of Alberta, and I would meet people there who said, when you became prime minister, it just was so exciting for me, and it completely changed the way I thought about things. And I had your picture up, and I thought, so to have been the vehicle for that sense of possibility was very exciting. But I would also point out that there's not been another woman prime minister since in Canada. In other words, it's harder than it looks to be elected leader of a party that could form a government, because a lot of people want those jobs. And I don't think that there hasn't been another one because of my experience. I just think that the way our party systems are structured, that there is kind of old boys networks and people who really want to do it. But we now have a number of quite promising women in the current government. There's a woman minister of finance, finally, who was a foreign minister, Christopher Freeland. So there's a number of women who are gaining stature. And I think within my lifetime, we'll see at least one more, probably more than one more. But I think, so you say so would I regret if I did it over again, would I do it? I think, well, yes, I would. And even the mistakes that I made, I think if I'd never made a mistake, I might have had a completely false view, A, of my own abilities, and B, I might not have appreciated the extent to which I sometimes was really lucky. So I think, you sometimes need to, step on your own foot and say, oh, that wasn't too smart, was it? And to have a sense of your own limitations and your own imperfections and not get too carried away with yourself. So I don't really think I have regrets in that sense. I mean, if there are things that I've done that hurt somebody's feelings or that kind of a thing, I would have a regret for maybe not have been doing something in a human way. But in terms of my political career, it was quite a ride. And there were a lot of things that I did where I was the first woman to do them. And, I think in in most cases, I did them pretty well. Could I pull the rabbit out of the hat in the 93 election? No, I couldn't. But I don't think anybody could have.
Thanks. Looking to the future, what do you have any thoughts about how conservatism has gone since after the downfall of the Progressive Conservative Party?
Well, it's become very right wing, and you know, I don't really have a party anymore in Canada. You know, when I was in the Progressive Conservative Party was a big tent party, and I guess I might have been what you call a red Tory in the sense that I was, you know, very socially liberal and certainly not opposed to, you know, programs that help people, whatever. I never. I mean, I guess I'm sort of like an Adam Smith story. If you actually read what Adam Smith wrote and what the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment wrote, you know, they're very humane and very much believing in the right of people to have a fair return on their labor. And, you know, the market is great, but not totally unregulated, not running like a casino. And of course, what we see in the market is that it's not just that it's unregulated sometimes, but that the finger is put on the scale for some people's interests as opposed to others. So I think that the Conservative Party in Canada is not sufficiently committed to dealing with climate change for me. And I mean, to me, that's a deal breaker for me. They actually had a convention where they were prepared to pass a resolution saying that, you know, it wasn't a serious issue. Now, the current leader of the party, you know, claims that he's got great plans for dealing with climate change. But this is where we need leadership and where we need to try and come together as societies. And I'm very relieved that Joe Biden has now recommitted America to leading in this area. And of course, the thing that's so ridiculous is that there's a lot of economic gain to be made by tackling these things, aside from the fact that, you know, a frazzled earth is not going to be very productive for anybody. And for your generation, I worry about it very much. You're entitled to have a beautiful earth. So anyway, so the notion that the things that have become partisan when they shouldn't be partisan, how can the science of climate change be partisan? Well, it's because there were large companies that decided that it was not in their interest to support changes. They knew it was real. That's interesting. That's the wicked thing about it, that they knew it was real. But they funded organizations to convince the public that the science was uncertain. They tried to delay responses for their own benefit. And they often, you know, the politicians that they supported were very often in conservative parties who may have been, in some cases, predisposed to not like regulation. You know, I think the whole important thing about regulation is that it needs to be smart. And I do believe that people need to be protected, consumer protection, health protection, etc. So I think there are issues that have changed the nature of conservatism as I knew it, and I don't consider myself a conservative in Canada anymore. I'm a woman without a party, so I rise above it all.
Wow, thank you. I think we're going to move on to some of the submitted student questions. Sarah from St. Catherine's writes, do you think with the recession of 2008 to 2009 and COVID-19 that we are heading towards the same global economic and political pathways as the 20s, 30s, and 40s?
Well, that's a very good question. I think not, but I think that there will be some people that you see, it really depends. If you have, like, until President Biden came along with his approach to dealing with the economic downturns created by COVID and his approach to reinvesting in the American economy, et cetera, his approach to how he deals with climate change, I would have been a lot more discouraged. But I think we are seeing, I mean, because I think America's leadership is very important. I think we're seeing some really useful steps that can help shift economies in ways that mitigate some of the negative effects that come when certain industries have to go out. It's like free trade agreements. I mean, at the end of the day, they increase the amount of economic activity, but the effects are not uniform. So I think the challenge will be dealing with the unequal effects of increased wealth and loss of income or changes in economic activity that negatively affect people. And if we have the maturity as societies and the competence as governments, which doesn't mean government doing everything, it means government doing the right things, empowering people, providing the right kinds of incentives, etc. If we do that correctly, I think we can avoid that, at least in the industrialized democracies. I can't speak for what will happen in other countries, because I think that the effect of climate change is going to be, it's not affected, it's not felt equally. And if the industrialized world that created a lot of the problem does not step up to help countries that are being disproportionately affected by it, then I think we could have some of those same forces, because what's important about it is not just that they are economically devastating, but that they lead politically quite naturally to political movements that are cynical and unhappy with governments, and quite rightly so. Unfortunately, what comes out of those movements is often, not a vast improvement.
On the question of ways to curb those movements, David from Churchill writes, did you find there was a component of informal cross-party cooperation or friendships in Parliament? Has this level changed over time? And how did you feel this affected politics?
Yes, I think there was. I think it's, I always say that political parties are ways of giving the voters choice, that people coalesce around certain kind of centers of gravity of policies and approaches that they believe in. And they allow voters to choose, but they're not religions. And ideas can evolve. Parties often will evolve the ideas that they have as they learn, as they grow. And when you have that kind of approach, then there's naturally room for cooperation across party lines. And when I was in government, there were a lot of the bills that I passed when I was justice minister, I passed with support from both sides of the House and some opposition in my own party. So there was a lot of, and incidentally, one of the things that is a feature when women come into legislative bodies is they're often much more willing to work across party lines, and particularly for issues where they have to, push their parties to recognize needs and interests of women and families. Where people used to say, well, let us solve the serious issues and then we'll do women's issues. Well, actually, women's issues are the serious issues, because they're so fundamental to how people live and survive. So I think it has changed. I think in the United States, it's the polarization is just scary, because it's not even about people saying, like with Barack Obama, when he was trying to create the Affordable Care Act, he gave up a lot of things that he would have liked to have had in his legislation, because he thought he was encouraging Republicans to come on side. And at the end, after he'd made those changes, none of them voted for it. And when I was a young woman growing up, politicians in the American Congress who could work across party lines were seen as master statesmen. I mean, this was a really good thing. Now, it's frowned upon, and people say, well, you're trading. You can't do that. So it has changed. I think less in Canada, perhaps. I'm not in Parliament now, so I can't tell you. And of course, now nobody's in Parliament; they're all on a screen. But it may, and you know what? And I think social media and the ability it has given people to do kind of instant responses, and the kind of intemperate responses that often result from being able to react very quickly to things, I think may also have solidified some of that polarization. But I don't think Canada is as bad, and I don't know what you think about in Britain, whether I mean, there's always been polarization between Labour and the Conservatives. Whether it's worse now than it was before, I don't know.
Speaking of inclusion, Lewis from Sydney writes, do you think the ableist ad in your campaign focused on your opponent's face affected your election chances?
Well, I think it did, but it wasn't meant to be an ableist ad, and I had nothing to do with making it. It was a picture that was like the picture that was of Jean Chrétien on the front of a magazine. But the ad itself, I was horrified when I saw the ad. And in those days, you couldn't just get it up on your phone. I mean, we had no, we didn't have internet. We had to wait till I got a VHS. And it was just stupid. And you know, my campaign chair called me the night before and said, you know, we're going to go a little negative tomorrow. And we're putting out an ad, and there's a picture of Jean Chrétien that was just like the ad that was on the cover of Maclean's, on the picture that was on the cover of Maclean's magazine, and it was just, yeah. And so it did, and it was stupid. And if you haven't asked for regret, I regret that. I regret that I wasn't in a position to stop that from happening, because you know, and the campaign team said, oh, we showed it to a focus group of liberals, and they didn't say anything wrong about it. But first of all, I'm a woman. I can't do negative advertising. And I used to say to them, if you want to do negative advertising, show a picture of Jean Chrétien standing in the House of Commons saying, the national debt doesn't matter, we only owe it to ourselves. Because he really did. You could show that. You know, focus on truth and reality. Don't, anyway, so the short answer is yes, I think it did hurt my campaign, no question about it. And
British corpus writes, sorry, to what extent do colonial legacies still typify the Canadian experience?
Oh, I think they do much more than most of us even want to recognize. And I think the truth and reconciliation process with our Indigenous people is only a very small start of understanding that. And I say that coming, you know, three of my grandparents were born in Scotland, and on the fourth side, I'm eighth generation Canadian. So, you know, I'm as much part of the problem as part of the solution. I think this is you know, it's a time. I often say I created a leadership college at the University of Alberta, and 1 year in our orientation, I decided this theme should be learning and unlearning. Then I think about my own lifetime, how many things I've learned, but how many things I've had to unlearn, things that I thought were true or that were comfortable to believe that aren't really true. And the way I see the world, the way I see people is very different because I've unlearned a lot of bad attitudes. And I think that we don't think of ourselves in Canada as being a colonial country. But we did come and colonize a country at the expense of its Indigenous people. And you know, we were also part of an empire that colonized a lot of other people, and that certainly affected our attitudes. So yes, and I think it's going to take time, and maybe this younger generation will be able to explore those ideas and deal with them. It's difficult because, you know, you don't want to ignore amazing things that were done, but you also don't want to ignore the extent to which people made assumptions and asserted privilege over people who were powerless to protect themselves.
Definitely. The last question of the night is from Christian from Peterhouse, asking, to what extent do you hold yourself responsible for the Progressive Conservative Party's collapse?
Not very much, simply because the race in 1993 was a five-party race. The Reform Party and the Bloc Québécois were both formed out of things that I don't think I could be held responsible for their creation. The Bloc, Lucien Bouchard resigned from our cabinet when the Meech-Lake Accord didn't go through, created the Bloc Québécois. Preston Manning had been attacking us for years in the West, and it was hard to believe that people would vote for parties that couldn't form a government. But both of those parties were directly attacking our voting base. So I kept our core vote, but our Quebec vote, I mean, when Lucien Bouchard resigned, my Quebec colleagues would come into caucus and they'd say, the Bloc has nominated this total non-entity in my riding, and he's already running ahead of me. You know, there were dynamics going on, a sense of Western alienation, a sense of frustration in Quebec. that played itself out in eroding the vote for the Progressive Conservative Party. And because our vote was spread across the country, it didn't translate into seats. Whereas both for the Bloc and the Reform Party, their votes were geographically concentrated. So they got a disproportionate number of seats. And I mean, so the Bloc Québécois, you can imagine, was the official opposition, simply because all their votes were concentrated in a place where they could win seats. So I don't. And it's not because I'm, not able to admit my mistakes. I can. But it would almost be hubris to say that I was responsible for it, because it would give me a lot more credit than I had. There was a political realignment, and it's taken a long time. It took a long time for a party that claimed to be a conservative party to put that back together. I think Preston Manning has a lot to answer for. He won't play with anybody else's ball and bat, and he destroyed the party that had given his part of the country the strongest representation it had had in my adult lifetime. So I would blame Preston Manning more than I would blame myself for that. And Lucien Bouchard. And again, our party embraced Quebec, and it wasn't enough for Lucien Bouchard. So between the two of them, I think they chopped up our voting bloc, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Thank you so much, Ms. Campbell, and a warm virtual round of applause.
Thank you, and all the best to you, really. I hope you're all enjoying your life as students and what you're learning, and watching as your lives unfold is going to be is very exciting. But care about democracy. It's you make it serve you, and make sure that it makes possible all of the changes you want to make, whether it's attacking colonialism or any of the other things that are in the way of justice for many people.
On that note, just a reminder of events this week. On Thursday, tomorrow at 8, our Thursday night debates are returning on the motion, "This House believes we are witnessing a global fascist resurgence." Friday at 4, we have our panel on sex work. On Sunday at 2, we're hosting speed skater Elise Christie. On Monday at 5, we're hosting a panel on the Windrush scandal in collaboration with Cambridge African Caribbean Society. And on Tuesday, we're welcoming Lord Alan Sugar. Remember to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and comment if you're enjoying our events. Thank you so much to Ms. Campbell for this event, and we really hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Good night.